The call came on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. My brother always chose ordinary days to detonate things. I was at my desk at the law firm where I'd worked as a paralegal for 6 years, buried in title searches, drinking bad coffee, doing what I always did when he called to tell me our mother had passed. She'd been in the memory care facility for 2 years by then. The end wasn't a surprise. But grief doesn't work on logic. I sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes before I could drive home. Our father had died 18 months earlier. Heart attack. Quick, at least. Mother's decline had been the slow kind, the kind that takes everything from everyone around her too. My brother and I had spent the last 3 years splitting every decision, every cost, every difficult phone call with the facility. Or so I thought. The estate attorney read the will 6 days after the funeral. My brother sat across from me in a gray suit that cost more than my monthly rent, looking like a man who already knew the ending of a movie he'd seen before. And he did know, because he'd helped write it. Our parents left 2 main assets. The first was a duplex in Columbus, fully rented, generating about $3,200 a month in income, assessed at $410,000. My brother got that. He was the real estate professional in the family, the attorney explained. It made practical sense. My brother nodded like he was accepting a minor inconvenience. The second asset was the farmhouse in Harlan County, eastern Kentucky. The house our grandparents built in 1941, the house where our mother grew up, where she brought us every summer until we were teenagers and too cool to care. It sat on 11 acres at the end of a gravel road that flooded every spring. The roof had been failing for a decade. The last inspection, done by an assessor my brother hired, valued it at $38,000 and noted it would require somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000 in structural repairs to be habitable. I got the farmhouse. My brother looked at me with something that wasn't quite sympathy. "It was Mom's favorite place," he said. "We thought you'd want it. I noticed that word. He used it like our parents had been involved. Like this was a consensus. Like I was supposed to feel grateful. I didn't fight it that day. I was still in the fog of grief. Still in the part where you nod at things because your brain can't process them as real. I signed the transfer documents. I drove home to my apartment in Cincinnati and sat on my kitchen floor and cried until I fell asleep. What I didn't know yet was that I was 3 weeks away from losing that apartment too. My lease was month to month by then. I'd let it slide to that because I'd been spending so much time in Columbus near the memory care facility, never knowing when the call would come. My landlord sent notice the day after I got back from the estate meeting he was selling the building. I had 60 days. I did the math. The math did not care about my feelings. With the estate costs, the gap in my savings from 3 years of helping with mother's care expenses, and the moving costs I hadn't budgeted for, I couldn't afford first, last, and deposit on anything decent in Cincinnati. I looked at numbers for 2 weeks and kept arriving at the same answer. The farmhouse was mine. It was all I had. My brother called when I told him my plan. I could hear something behind his voice, not concern. Exactly. More like recalculation. "That house is not livable," he said. "You understand that, right? The inspector said the foundation has issues. I'll figure it out. You could sell it. I'll buy it from you. I'll give you $45,000, which is more than market given the condition. I'm moving in." Silence. Then, "Okay, that's your choice." The way he said it, "that's your choice," sounded like a door closing. I packed what fit in my car and a small U-Haul trailer. I drove 4 hours southeast to a house that had been empty for 11 years, since our grandmother died and our parents couldn't bear to sell it but also couldn't bear to be in it. I arrived on a Thursday evening in November. The gravel road was rutted from fall rains. My headlights hit the house and I sat in the car for a long moment before I could make myself go in. It looked exactly like abandonment looks. The porch sagged on one side. 2 windows on the second floor were covered with plywood. Vines had worked their way up the east wall and were beginning to pry at the siding. The yard was nothing but dead weeds and old fence posts. Inside was cold and smelled of closed-up thyme, wood, and dust, and something faintly sweet that I would later identify as an old mouse situation in the kitchen wall. The electricity still worked. Barely. One circuit kept tripping. I found the bedroom that had been my mother's as a girl, put my sleeping bag on the old mattress, and lay there listening to the house settle around me in the dark. I was 31 years old, alone in a condemned farmhouse in eastern Kentucky, with no plan beyond surviving the next morning. I am a paralegal. I have spent 6 years reading legal documents, researching property records, tracing titles, finding the thing buried in the fine print that everyone else skipped. It's not a glamorous skill, but it is a precise one. And when you spend enough time doing detail work for a living, your brain starts doing it automatically, even when you're not at work. That habit is what saved me. I'd been in the house for 9 days, working through it room by room, cleaning, assessing, making lists of what needed to happen before winter got serious. The fireplace in the main room was the thing I was most worried about. It was the only real heat source besides space heaters, and I didn't know the last time the chimney had been cleaned. I called a local sweep who came out and declared it functional, but told me the brick on the left interior wall of the firebox had shifted. He pried at one of the loose bricks while I watched. Behind it, Instead of the mortar and structure I expected, there was a hollow space. Not large, about the size of a shoebox. Inside the hollow, a metal tin, the kind that used to hold Christmas cookies, sealed with a strip of electrical tape that had dried and cracked with age. Inside the tin, a folded piece of wax paper, 2 rubber-banded bundles of documents, and a small brass key. I set everything on the kitchen table and went through it slowly, the way I'd been trained to go through anything that might matter. The first bundle was letters between my grandfather and someone named Raymond Cutler, dated between 1952 and 1961. I read them in order. They were discussing the terms of a surface rights sale. My grandfather had sold the surface rights to 240 acres of land adjacent to the farmhouse's 11 acres, sold them to a timber company for a price that, in the 1950s, was probably significant. But the letters made clear, repeatedly, that the mineral rights were not included in that sale. My grandfather was emphatic about it in his handwriting, which was small and careful, and underlined things for emphasis. The mineral rights stay with the family. That is not negotiable, Raymond Cutler agreed in writing, twice. The second bundle was more recent. Copies of deeds, filed in Harlan County, running from the original land grant through several transfers. I traced the chain. The surface rights had changed hands 3 times since my grandfather's sale, but in every deed, the mineral rights, specifically coal, oil, natural gas, and any subsurface resources, were noted as accepted and reserved, retained by the Caldwell family. By us. My grandfather's name was Thomas Caldwell. My mother's maiden name was Caldwell. She had inherited those mineral rights when her parents died, which meant they were part of her estate, which meant they should have been in the will. They were not in the will. I had read that document 5 times. I went to my laptop and pulled up the Harlan County Property Records database, which I knew how to navigate because it wasn't that different from the systems I used at work. I searched for any active leases or royalty agreements associated with the mineral rights on those parcels. What I found made me sit back in my chair and stop breathing for a moment. In 2013, a natural gas company called Appalachian Basin Resources had entered into a mineral lease agreement with the rights holder for those 240 acres. The lease was for an initial term of 10 years with automatic renewal provisions. The royalty rate was 18% of production value. The agreement had been signed by Thomas Caldwell Estate, represented by, I had to read it twice, by my brother, as executor of our grandfather's estate. Our grandfather died in 1989. My brother was 12 years old. That wasn't possible. Unless someone had created a fraudulent entity and used a dead man's estate as a vehicle to receive royalty payments. I've read enough documents to know what that looks like when I see it. I sat at that kitchen table until 2 a.m, going through everything I could access. The Harlan County Clerk's Office, the Kentucky Department of Revenue's online records, the Secretary of State's Business Entity Database. There was a registered entity, Thomas Caldwell Estate, LLC, filed in 2012. Registered agent, my brother. Member, my brother. Bank account, not publicly accessible, but the entity existed, and it was active, and my brother controlled it entirely. The natural gas royalties had been paid to that account since 2013. 11 years. I couldn't see the exact amounts from public records, but I knew enough about royalty structures to know that 18% of production from 240 acres of natural gas rights in active Kentucky Hill Country, over 11 years, was not a small number. My brother had known about these mineral rights. He had created a legal structure to receive the income, and when he drafted our parents' estate plan, he was listed as the drafter's contact on the will. I'd noticed it in the paperwork. He had left the mineral rights out entirely. He hadn't forgotten. He'd hidden them. I thought about his voice on the phone when I said I was moving in. That recalculation I'd heard. He knew I'd be going through the house. He must have assumed there was nothing here to find, that the documents, if they'd ever existed in physical form at all, were long gone. A house that had been sitting empty for 11 years. A sister who was grieving and financially desperate. He probably thought the math worked out cleanly in his favor. He didn't know I open walls for a living. He didn't know I read old papers the way other people read menus. I called an estate attorney in Lexington the next morning. I'd found her through a colleague at my firm. She specialized in estate fraud and had a reputation for not blinking at complicated family situations. I drove the 4 hours to meet her with the tin and every document I'd photographed and printed. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she looked at everything I'd brought and said, in a very level voice, that what I was describing was estate fraud, that the assets had been deliberately concealed from the will, that my brother had been collecting income that legally belonged to my mother's estate, which meant it belonged to me and my brother jointly, while the estate was open, and to the estate's beneficiaries once closed. Since the estate had been closed without those assets listed, she said, we would need to file to reopen it. And the royalties he's collected? I asked. Owed back to the estate. With interest. She paused. There may also be criminal exposure. I drove back to the farmhouse in the dark. I thought about my brother in his gray suit. I thought about the way he'd said, that's your choice, like I was a minor inconvenience he'd already calculated around. I thought about my mother in that memory care facility, and who had handled her financial affairs in those last years, and what else might have been quietly redirected. I stopped thinking like a grieving sister. I shifted into the mode that had always kept me functional when everything else was difficult. The paralegal mode. The one that strips emotion out of a problem and treats it as a document to be read correctly. You don't react. You document. You file. You build the record. The attorney filed a petition to reopen the estate. She filed a separate civil fraud complaint. She contacted the Kentucky Attorney General's office, which has jurisdiction over estate fraud, and provided everything I'd found in the tin. She also filed an emergency injunction to freeze the Thomas Caldwell Estate LLC account pending investigation. My brother called me the day the injunction hit. His voice was different this time. The composure was still there. He was good at composure, but there was something underneath it now. A vibration, like a structure under load. I don't know what you think you found, he said, but those mineral rights were a separate matter that Dad and I had discussed. There was an agreement. In writing? Silence. My attorney will be in touch with your attorney, I said. I'd recommend you get one. I hung up. The investigation took 8 months. During that time I lived in the farmhouse, which I heated with the fireplace and 2 space heaters and stubbornness. I got the roof patched with some of the money my attorney helped me access as an emergency draw from the frozen estate account. I kept working remotely for the firm, which had been gracious enough to let me shift to that arrangement. I learned to live with the farmhouse the way you learn to live with anything difficult, by paying it a certain respect, by not pretending it was something it wasn't. There were good days. The land was genuinely beautiful in a way that caught me off guard. Snow on those 11 acres, on the old fence lines, on the ridge beyond, it looked like something you'd hang on a wall. The financial forensics took most of those 8 months. A court-appointed accountant went through the Thomas Caldwell Estate LLC's records in full once the account was unfrozen for examination. The natural gas royalties paid between 2013 and the date of the injunction totaled $2.1 million. My brother had taken distributions of $1.87 million over 11 years. The remainder was still in the account. On top of that, the mineral rights themselves, the ongoing value of an active natural gas lease on 240 acres, with decades of potential remaining, were appraised at between $6 and $8 million, depending on future production. Projections. The estate fraud settlement was reached without going to criminal trial, though the AG's office made clear that was contingent on my brother making full restitution and cooperating with the civil process. He paid back $1.87 million to the estate plus legal interest. The mineral rights were formally transferred to the estate and then distributed. My brother received his share 25% per the will's standard distribution clause, and I received mine. My share of the back royalties, after the split and fees, was just over $900,000. My share of the ongoing mineral rights estate was valued at approximately $4.2 million. The Columbus duplex, it turned out, had also been undervalued in the estate documents by roughly $180,000. My attorney addressed that too, in a separate motion. My brother settled it quietly. I stood in the front yard of the farmhouse on a morning in late October, 8 months after finding that tin in the fireplace wall, and looked at the property in a way I hadn't let myself look at it before. The roof was patched. The porch was still sagging. The vines were still working at the east wall, but the land was there, all 11 acres of it, plus the mineral rights to 240 acres beyond, and it was mine, and it had always been mine, and the only reason I hadn't known that was because someone had decided I wouldn't care enough to look. He had assumed grief makes people careless. He had assumed that a woman living in a condemned farmhouse in eastern Kentucky, emotionally hollowed out and financially stretched, would just be grateful for what she'd been given and wouldn't notice what was missing. He didn't account for the fact that I read documents for a living. He didn't account for the fact that empty houses and old papers and small hidden things are exactly what I'm trained to find. I hired a contractor, a local man who knew the house's era and treated its bones with actual respect, and we began the full restoration. Not a demolition, not a flip, not a quick fix. A real restoration. The kind that takes time and attention and costs more per square foot because you're preserving something worth preserving. The foundation was repaired. The wiring was brought up to code. The original hardwood floors, buried under decades of peel and stick linoleum, were revealed and refinished to something that stopped contractors in their tracks when they first saw it. The fireplace was restored last. The mason we brought in was from the next county, an older man who'd been doing this work for 40 years. When he reset the left interior wall of the firebox, carefully relaying the brick, he looked at the hollow space behind where the tin had been, and nodded slowly, like he'd seen this before. "Lot of old houses in this county have them," he said. "People kept things they didn't trust anyone to find. Before banks. Before they trusted banks, anyway." "Smart people," I said. He looked at me and smiled. "Smart people." I kept the farmhouse. I also purchased a small office space in the nearest town, and set up a practice, a paralegal services firm, focusing on property research and estate documentation for families in the county who'd never had anyone explain to them what they actually owned. There are more of those families than you'd think, in places like Harlan County. Old land, old rights, old documents tucked in walls and shoeboxes, and the backs of filing cabinets, waiting for someone who knew how to read them. My brother and I have not spoken since the settlement. His attorney and my attorney exchanged the final paperwork in a conference room in Columbus, and that was the end of it. I don't know what he tells people. I don't need to know. The documents tell the story clearly enough, and documents don't lie the way people do. What I know is this. He looked at that farmhouse and saw a liability. He saw a crumbling thing in a hollow in eastern Kentucky, a thing that would cost money and time and attention, a thing that a grieving woman with empty pockets might be managed into accepting as her lot. He saw all of that and decided it was worthless. He forgot that worthless and undiscovered are two completely different things. He forgot that some things only look abandoned, that the walls of old houses hold what the people who built them decided to keep safe, that an 11-acre property in the mountains of eastern Kentucky can look like nothing and sit on something that changes every calculation you thought you'd already made. He forgot that the woman he handed a garbage inheritance to had spent 6 years reading the fine print of things that looked settled. He should have read the fine print. He should have read me the same way. The farmhouse still has the hollow space behind the left brick in the firebox. I asked the mason to leave it open. No tin, no contents. Just the space itself visible now, if you know to look. I see it every time I light a fire in the winter, and every time I do, I think about my grandfather's handwriting, small and careful and underlined for emphasis. The mineral rights stay with the family. That is not negotiable. He was right about that. He was right about all of it. He just didn't know that 11 years later, someone in that family would finally be paying close enough attention to find out.